Okay. Right. Hi everyone. Welcome to PSY 4050. That's the MSc Programs Quantitative Research Methods module. So I just thought I'd record an audio version of the first lecture, the introductory lecture, to supplement the actual lecture I'll give in person also. To help me work out the timings of the material that I've got to cover in this session. Okay, so my name is Rob Spencer. As you can see on this slide, I'm the module leader. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at Middlesex University. This module is about quantification, so that's representing data numerically. So we can use maths and statistics to analyse and understand that data and answer interesting research questions in a scientific manner. So we are quantifying things using numbers. So we're going to do statistics, and that is a subdiscipline of maths, essentially. Now that we've got that out in the open, I'm going to tell you not to get anxious about it and not to worry about it. Most of the maths that we will do on this module, we're going to use software to do the calculations for us, and everybody on this module is more than capable of understanding the maths and the formulas, the statistical formulae that we're going to cover on the module. Okay, so I understand a lot of people have maths anxiety, and that's probably because when you were taught maths at school, you were led to believe you either had an aptitude for it or not. That was the same. I was the same, essentially. But what I would say to you is that it's not the case, that you get good at this stuff only through hard work and practice. Okay, so it's going to be challenging. The content we cover on this material is going to be challenging, and you will probably feel uncomfortable some of the time. I feel like that all the time. Essentially, I spend most of my days thinking about statistical analyses and how to analyse data, and trying to improve my knowledge of that. And that's it. I spend a lot of my time feeling confused and then wondering if I've really understood things properly. So you're probably going to feel a little bit uncomfortable and challenged by this module as well. And that's true for me even when I'm thinking about the kind of foundational concepts that we're going to cover on this module as well. I'm always looking for ways to increase my understanding of those things and find better ways to explain them so I can teach them better to you guys, essentially. One thing I will say about this module is that this is one of the best modules that you're going to do on your course. And it's an opportunity for you to actually acquire some high value skills. So data science skills, data analysis skills are highly sought after today. And the whole point of going to universities, like you guys are, and doing postgraduate degrees, is that you leave the university more productive. And this is one module that can help you do that and make you a better informed member of society and a better scientist by giving you the skills to understand and evaluate data. And you have to remember, hopefully everyone knows this by now, that psychology is a technical science, and science is about problem solving, the type of problem solving that we're going to do on this module. Okay. So mostly in social science and psychology departments, research methods modules are kind of seen as something to be endured, something that you just have to get through and pass. And I don't want that to be the case with this module. You are going to have to pass it. I'll say more about the assessment shortly. But what I want to challenge you guys to actually engage with the material, so you develop an interest and learn more and develop the skills of using and analysing data. It'll make you a better scientist in the long run. So that's all I'm going to say as an introduction really to the module. I'll elaborate a little bit more, I think, in the actual lecture, the live lecture. So let's get on with the rest of today's session. What have we got to cover? So these are the aims, these are the things we're going to do. We're going to introduce the module. I've got a few more slides that do that. Provide an overview of the research process. I'm going to outline selected research design methods in psychology. I'm going to outline scales of measurement. We're going to define what variables are, and then we'll review some fundamental research principles and terminology. Okay, so this week's lecture, the material we'll cover this week, and the second session in week 3, we're getting through a lot of kind of foundational concepts. This week I'm talking about research design. Essentially, I've got quite a bit of that to cover. But after this week, we'll cover some more statistical concepts, and then from week 5 onwards, the third session onwards, we should actually be able to get down to running different statistical analyses on data and things like that. So the first couple of weeks, really, they're quite content heavy in terms of conceptual material, and I kind of packed that in to try to give us as much time as possible to kind of work on and practice and play around with, learn about the statistical analyses that we're going to be doing. Okay, so learning outcomes. At the end of week 1, you should understand the structure, teaching, assessment of the module. The research process, understand what populations and samples are, we define those things for us, know their relationship to parameters and statistics, be able to differentiate between methods for selecting samples, define what variables are and the types of scale of measurement that you might use for a variable, and you should know about research designs for collecting data to investigate some sort of question. You should also be able to tell the difference between independent and dependent variables. So all kind of, hopefully for a lot of people, this is kind of revision of stuff that you might have done at undergraduate level. And not something you're encountering for the first time. Okay, module introduction. So I've put it in bold and in much larger font there. Read the handbook. It is available on the UniHub module page. If you go on there, there's a PDF version of it. You can download it, read that. It's got useful information about the module including what the assessment is, how that's going to work, and the timetable. You need to know what the timetable is. If you look, you get to see what the readings are, what material we're covering in different weeks. So that is all quite useful. So familiarise yourself with that. So in terms of the timetable, the classes are on odd numbered teaching weeks, so weeks 1, 3, 5, etc. throughout the year, and they are the module. The format of the module is basically a lecture. 1 hour lecture from me in person, and then we, in smaller groups, will be conducting lab classes that are going to be like 2 hours long, essentially. So in the lecture, I'll cover theoretical stuff, conceptual stuff. I'll outline what a type of statistical analysis is, how it works, what it's used for, and then we will kind of reiterate that information, what the key ideas are from the lecture in the lab class, and then we'll actually do some worksheets, and we will run some analyses. Okay, so the way it's roughly split, it's not a kind of an exact split, but in the first term up to Christmas we'll be focusing more on univariate analyses, and in the second term we'll focus on more multivariate, sort of slightly more complex analyses. Okay, so the assessment for the module, there is one piece of summative assessment. Okay, so your module grade is based on one piece of assessment, and that is an in-class practical assessment in the week 23 lab classes. Okay, so it's an open book practical assessment. How it's going to work is this: essentially, you you will be able to access at the time of the assessment. You will be able to access a folder on UniHub. It'll have a data set in it. It'll have a question paper. You'll open the data set. You'll open the question paper, and you'll run in order to answer the questions. You will run certain analyses and report the results essentially, or answer the questions based on the results you get, the output you get from analysing data using certain different statistical techniques. Okay, and as it says there in brackets, it's an open book test, so your notes that you make throughout the year, you can take them in with you and you can refer to them. Okay. There's also in terms of formative assessments, so these formative being assessments that they don't count towards your grade, but they're a way for you to check your understanding, get some practice with the sorts of questions you'd probably be doing on the practical assessment, that type of thing. In lab classes each week, we'll be completing worksheets. Some of them I'll walk through with you, and then there'll be additional ones like exercise sheets that you can do in your own time. Okay, and there are also some, last year with this module when it ran, there were 3 online MCQ tests that you could do as formative assessment in your own time. I can make those available as well, the links for those, and people can do them as and when they see fit. Just give you some practice, test your own understanding of how well you've understood the material we've covered. The formative MCQs give you kind of feedback on how many questions you've got right and stuff like that. Okay, right, let's move on. So the research process. Okay, so on this slide, the content on the left of this slide, which is a long list, it outlines what the research process is, and as you can see, there are a number of steps when we're conducting research in scientific disciplines such as psychology. The content on the left I got from the slides that we used last year. They were put together by my colleague Jean Wall, and that's kind of a detailed step-by-step breakdown of what the research process consists of. I've summarized it under 4 kind of headings, which are put on the right of the slide. So the four general steps you take when you're conducting research are: you formulate some sort of research question, you design a study and you collect data, you then analyze and interpret that data, then you present the findings and results in some way, be it a journal article, a book, a presentation, etc. Okay, but if we go into more detail on each of those steps, so the formulating the research question, that involves things such as coming up with some sort of initial research question and topic, and then conducting a literature review. So you've got some question that you want to answer about some interesting behaviour that you think is important. Then what you do is you review the literature that already exists in relation to that research question. Okay, so there could have been already lots of research done on it, and if you go and do some research that's already been done, that's kind of poor scholarship, because you should have had a look to see if you were wasting your time or not. Okay, so you conduct a literature review, you figure out what things are known and what research has already been done, and you look to see what things we still need answers to, and then you've used that really for the next step, where you refine your research question and aims. So what you want to be doing is trying to fill in the gaps of knowledge by figuring out what things we still need to know, what questions still need better answers to them, based on your literature review. Once you've come up with a kind of more definite research question and some aims, you need to choose a method that you're going to use to conduct the study, and I'll say more about that shortly, and we're going to come on to this research design essentially. So it could be experimental design, a pseudo-experimental design. It could be a questionnaire type of design, that type of thing. Okay. Once you have chosen the method you're going to use, that's going to influence this at the next bit, which is how you, what the design of the study actually looks like. How you actually, if you're doing an experiment, how are you actually going to collect the data for that to answer your question? So that includes figuring out who the participants are going to be, where you're going to get them from, how you're going to recruit them to collect your data. Very tricky thing to do. It's hard to get people to take part in research. What materials you need in order to successfully collect this data to conduct research, and the procedure you need to follow to what you need to do step by step from getting your participants there to collect the data from, to take part in your research, and the steps you have to walk them through in order for you to successfully collect some data from them. Okay, so once you've decided that, once you've got an idea of how that's going to look, you kind of write that down, and then you need to get ethical approval for your research before you start collecting any data. Okay, so all research that you're involved in, that you conduct as part of your university career, has to be ethically approved. Certainly when it involves kind of studying people or animals, for that matter. You've decided on your question, you've chosen a particular method you're going to use, and you've come up with the design of the study, who you're going to use, how you're going to do it. You write all that down and you apply for ethical approval. And hopefully, if there are no ethical issues, you're not doing anything that's kind of dangerous or harmful to people, then you should get that. Once you have ethical approval, you can then start collecting data. Essentially, that's kind of hard work and time consuming. Once you've collected as much data as you can, largely, or you might have a specified amount that you want, and you can stop once you get that, but usually in disciplines such as this, what you get is what you get, essentially. Once you've done that, then you can start analysing data. Doing the types of analyses we'll focus on in this module. And then once you've analysed it, once you've analysed your data in some way, using statistical methods, you're going to interpret your findings, the findings of the output, and then you're going to, once you've interpreted that output, you need to write it up. What do these results show? Essentially, you need to write that up, and hopefully you might have found something interesting that you can use to write a journal article, or maybe form part of some sort of book, or post a presentation or conference paper if you're giving a talk. In your case, the kind of research you were doing, your MSc dissertations, you're gonna write a thesis based on what you collect. Okay, so there's lots of steps there. Today I'm going to be talking about kind of the research design and collecting data side of things, but most of this module after today, we're going to be focused on the two steps in particular there, which is analysing data and interpreting the findings. That's what this module is essentially about. Okay. Right. Before we move on any further, just a quick note on quantitative versus qualitative research. These are often used to define between research methods, but the types of research they refer to, it relates more to the type of data that's obtained. So as I said, this is a module about quantitative research methods, and quantitative data are numerical. For example, experimental studies. Qualitative research usually involves data that's not numerical, so for example, descriptions of behaviour or content of participants' responses to interviews. So it often involves analysing text in some way and interpreting what that means. So these qualitative research might involve some sort of observational study and recording what happens, or maybe even interview studies. You can quantify that type of information, but it's in most cases when people conduct that type of research, they're doing it using qualitative research methods. And in practice, you can actually combine these two approaches using what's often referred to as mixed methods. So you might collect a load of textual data, interview data. You might analyse it in one way using some sort of qualitative methodology, and you might also supplement that with some sort of quantification of certain answers to see if you get some sort of statistically interesting pattern. Okay, so that is just a quick rundown of the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. This module is not about qualitative research. This was a slide that was used last year by my colleague. I thought I'd keep it in. This is as much as I'm really going to say about qualitative research on this module. Okay, that's as much qualitative teaching as I'm doing this year. And pretty much everything else, definitely everything else we'll be doing on the module is quantitative. We're going to be numerically where you're going to be assigning numbers to things to measure them and using statistical analyses to find interesting patterns in data and answering interesting research questions. All right, let's talk about populations and samples. So what I'm going to do over the next few slides is basically review some fundamental research principles and terminology, essentially. So a population is an individual or group that represents all members of a certain group or category of interest. So, for example, that could be the population of all students at Middlesex University. So we could be doing some research and the population of interest is all students at Middlesex University. It could mean, the population could mean the entire population of the country. In most cases, it doesn't, and it would be hard to collect data from all them. But generally, it's hard to collect data from any population. A sample, alternatively, is a subset drawn from the larger population of interest. So, for example, if our population of interest for whatever research we're doing was all students at Middlesex University, a sample would be data collected from, say, 500 Middlesex University students on some particular measure we were interested in. Okay, a parameter is a value generated from or applied to a population. So, for example, if we collected data on the height of every single student at Middlesex University and calculated the mean or average height, okay, so this would be a big undertaking. There are thousands of students, but if let's say we were capable of doing it, we measured the height of every single student at Middlesex, then we worked out the average height. That mean, or that average, would be a parameter, as it is based on data for the whole population of interest. Okay, a statistic, in contrast, is a value derived from sample data. Okay, so if we collected data on the height of 500 Middlesex University students, okay, so our sample of 500 students, if we measured their heights and then calculated the mean average height, what we've obtained is a sample statistic in relation to height. And we assume that this statistic is a good estimate of our population mean or our population parameter. So statistics are derived from sample data, parameters are derived from or applied to population data. Is the key point of interest there. And we often use statistics from samples to estimate true population parameters. They're often our best estimates. And we have to work with them in many cases because it's impossible to access the whole population, or it would be just impractical to try to collect that data. Okay, it could be way too large. So, as I said previously, populations don't have to consist of people, of all the people in the population, such as the entire population. When we talk about population, we're not talking about the entire population of the world. It's a population that relates to some characteristic of interest that we are looking at for our research. Populations don't actually have to refer to people at all. They could consist of other things, though, in psychology. You know, so it could be, we might be doing research about transport, and it could be we could be interested in the population of all cars in a particular London borough or something like that, if we were looking at congestion maybe or something. So it doesn't have to be people the population is made up of. But in psychology, it often is the case that it's people. Okay. Often the researcher defines the population of interest either explicitly or implicitly based on their research question. And it's important to remember that samples may not necessarily be good representations of the population from which they were selected. So, for example, let me think of something. If we were conducting research looking at adolescent mental health, and whoever the researcher is conducting this, they sample from, because they only have access to a group of, say, 15-year-olds who visited some sort of mental health service in the last year. Okay, we've got a sample of adolescents. We're interested in mental health, but the problem is it's not necessarily representative of our population of interest, which is mental health generally among adolescents. Okay, it's going to be biased in some ways because all we've done. There may be some differences that are important when we're looking at adolescent mental health between people who actually seek out help from some sort of mental health service and those who don't. And adolescents consist of people of a number of ages and not just 15-year-olds. Okay, so not always the case that our sample is a good representation of the population. We have to think that through carefully when we're conducting research. Generally, we want to use samples that generalize to the larger population. So with some degree of accuracy, hopefully our sample should match or correspond to the patterns of interest in our population of interest. And that is difficult if the population isn't clearly defined. So that comes down to defining what our research question is and identifying the population of interest and the participants we need to answer that question. Descriptive statistics only apply to the members of a sample or population from which the data has been collected. Right? Sometimes we might want to describe the characteristics of a sample, but for the most part, we are more concerned with what our sample tells us about the population. Okay. Inferential statistics, where we actually infer relationships and possibly causation, refers to the use of sample data to reach some conclusions about the characteristics of the larger population that the sample is supposed to represent. So when we use, we'll cover this more in the next session in week 3, but when we use descriptive statistics, we're kind of, as the name suggests, we're describing the sample or population from which they've been drawn. Inferential statistics, we're actually using statistical analyses to make draw some sort of conclusions about our research question. So to make the leap from sample data to inference about the population, we must be clear about whether the sample represents the population. If they do, then observations in the sample data should hold true for the population. Okay, so we have to clearly define the sample. We have to clearly define the population that we think the sample is alleged to represent. Okay, so not a straightforward thing to do always. Right. Moving on. Okay, so just something, a bit of a review, a refresher. It may be completely new to some people because it was never explained to them. I'm just going to cover some conventions in relation to notation that are commonly used in maths, in statistics, essentially. So there are conventions in stats between the use of Greek and Roman or Latin characters. So Greek letters are often used to refer to attributes of a population, or Greek characters. Okay, Latin letters or characters are used to refer to the attributes of a sample from which you have collected data. So some examples there on this slide So the kind of U type of shaped character is a Greek character. It's the letter mu. I think that's the lowercase version of mu, and it refers to the population mean. We'll see that quite frequently. X bar, unfortunately, this is kind of warped a little bit on my slide. So it's the one underneath there. It's an X and there's a line. And the line should actually be above the X. So it's X with a little bar across the top. And you'll hear people refer to it as X bar. That's obviously the Latin character X, and it's used to refer to the sample mean. So this is a commonly used convention. When you're looking at statistical formulae, when you see these things, you kind of have a good idea what they mean. Mu is going to be referring to the population mean. X bar is going to be referring to a sample mean of some sort. Other examples would be the Greek character sigma that you can see there. That refers to the standard deviation of a population. Commonly used. The Latin character S refers to the standard deviation of a sample. Okay, so if you see sigma, you know that the formula is talking about the population standard deviation. If you see S, you know it's referring to a sample. Okay, another convention that's quite commonly used is capitalization. So very common statistical convention. So it's quite common for capital letters to be used to refer to population attributes, okay, and lowercase letters to be used to refer to sample attributes. So an example would be the capital letter N could refer to a population, whereas the lowercase letter n could refer to a sample from that population. We usually use n if our sample size is 140 people, we'd say n is 140, that type of thing. Okay. I put this slide in. I got it from a textbook online called Open Intro Statistics, which is a pretty good book. I like it very much. Just to give you an idea about sampling. So that's what I'm going to talk about next in the forthcoming slides. So sampling. These images give you an idea. So the kind of circle with all the blue dots in refers to the population of interest, and the circle with the red dots extracted are samples from that population, essentially. So the first picture there, we've got all graduates. So the population of interest for a research question might be all graduates, all people with a degree. And there you've got a much smaller sample of people taken from that to answer some sort of research question. On the other side of the slide, conversely, your population might be a bit more specific than that. So in this case, it's graduates from all health-related fields. So it's a much smaller population, and then there's a sample being drawn from that in these images. Okay, so it gives you an idea of how we might sample from the population. There are various ways to do it, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So there are a number of ways that researchers can select samples from populations, like we saw on that slide before. Firstly, there's random sampling, and this is kind of most useful, but it can also be quite difficult to conduct. In statistics, random has a very specific meaning. It doesn't mean haphazard. It means that every member of a defined population has an equal chance of being selected into a sample. Okay, so a major benefit to random sampling is that any differences between the sample and population from which it was selected will not be systematic. Okay, so systematic in this case meaning non-random. Yeah. Random samples may differ from the population, but those differences are due to chance rather than some sort of systematic bias in the selection process. So random sampling is quite useful when we are picking who to include in our research. So the second option there is representative samples. So we could use representative samples. This is where the researcher selects cases so that they will match the larger population on specific characteristics. So we may want to select subgroups in the sample that match their representation in the underlying population. So for example, if 15% of the population were retirees, we've got some research question that we're looking at. We might want to use a representative sample, or we select a sample that specifically includes 15% of the people in it that being retired, people from the retired community. Okay. And the third one on there, convenience sampling. Actually, no. Before I move on to talk about convenience sampling, what else might be interesting to say about representative sampling? If we've kind of selected based on proportions of certain characteristics as they to match the underlying population, with what we're doing with representative sample is we ensure we get a sample that looks similar to the population on some variable of interest. Doing representative sampling though can be costly, and it can be hard to achieve, but it does increase the chance of you being able to generalize the results from your sample to the population. Okay, the third one then, convenience sampling. In this, the researchers select participants on the basis of proximity. So that's ease of access and willingness to participate in the research. If the convenience sample does not differ from the population of interest in ways that influence the outcome of the study, then it's an acceptable method. Generally, convenience sampling is probably one of the most common methods used. Because as I said earlier, and you guys probably have some experience with this yourself, it's very difficult to get people to participate in studies. So we often have to just take who we can, essentially, to participate in our research. Okay, let's move on. Variables. Let's define some variables. So a variable is anything that can be codified and have more than a single value. Okay, so for example, that could be income, it could be sex, it could be age, it could be height, etc. I guess the list is countably infinite. Alternatively, a constant has a fixed value. It's only a single score. So for example, if all of our sample is male, then we could say we've kept sex as a constant. It's not a variable, everyone's a male in the sample for whatever reason. It's part of our research question. Okay, so some types of variables are quantitative variables. Okay, so this is this is quantitative and qualitative variables shown on this. So these are quantitative and qualitative variables as distinct from quantitative and qualitative research. Yeah, you will hear this kind of terminology used. If someone's talking about a qualitative variable, they're talking about something specifically, not necessarily qualitative research was used. Okay, so quantitative variables, they are scored in such a way that the numbers or values indicate some sort of amount. So for example, height. They can be continuous, they can be discrete, or they can be, or they're often called scale variables. Okay, so continuous variable would be something measured on in an infinitely divisible way to however many decimal places might be necessary, often on the real number line. Discrete would mean it can only take on certain values, so it could be, scores on a test out of 20, so 1 out of 20, 2 out of 20, 3, 4, 5, etc. Scale variables is a term that's often used for these types of quantitative variables, where you're actually measuring things such as it could be height, which you can measure to an infinite, like a level of precision, or it could be scores on some questionnaire, something like that. personality score on some sort of questionnaire. We often refer to them as scale variable. Often refer to those types of things as scales. Okay. Alternatively, qualitative variables are things that are essentially categories or categorical variables. You often hear them referred to as nominal variables as well. So they're variables for which the assigned values don't indicate more or less of some quantity. So for, I mean, the easiest example is say sex. We'd often use some sort of dummy code in our analysis. So we'd record maybe 0 is male, 1 is female, something like that. So in this case, 1's not actually a higher value on the scale. It's just a dummy code for a different category. So if we coded our if we had a variable that involved recording the sex of different participants, you'd know that 0 was male, 1 was female, for example, if that's the coding we used. A common qualitative variable is that type of variable. It's often referred to as a dichotomous variable where you've got two categories. So nominal variables, categorical variables, they refer to the same thing. I believe in SPSS it kind of it records nominal, it records categorical variables, it gives them the name nominal, and continuous and discrete variables for quantitative variables refers to them as scale. Okay, scale variables. Right. Okay, slide 13. Scales of measurement. So there are 4 different scales of measurement for variables. These are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So nominal, as I said, refers to categorical variables. Cases fall into different categories. It's pretty straightforward. Ordinal, with ordinal data, values are placed in a meaningful order. The differences between values are not equal, or they're difficult to gauge in a meaningful way. So a good example of this would be, so if we took the people, say the results from the last Olympics of the high jump or something like that, someone got a gold, someone got silver, someone got a bronze. So in order of best, in descending order of which was better, slightly worse. Okay. But we don't actually know much or anything really about the differences in terms of the heights people jumped, so between gold, silver and bronze. It could be the case that the person who got gold jumped 2 centimeters higher than the person who got silver, but the person who got silver jumped a foot higher than the person who got bronze. Yeah, so the order is important. It tells us the ranking from highest to lowest or vice versa, but we've not got a real gauge on the distance between our measurements. Okay. Alternatively, interval data it builds on that slightly. So we have values placed in order, but they also have equal distance between each unit on the scale. So you'll see this referred to as interval data. The correct name for it is actually equal interval data, and that makes it much easier to remember. If you refer to it as equal interval data, it makes it easy to remember what the differences are between that and ordinal data. Ordinal data is just ordered. Equal interval data is ordered, but we also know the distance between the points on the scale is equal. So 2 is the same distance from 1 as 3 is from 2, as 4 is from 3. Okay, that type of thing. So each unit has the same distance of measurement as we go up our ordinal scale. Okay, our interval scale. Ratio data is measured on a numerical scale, and it has a real 0 value. So it could be discrete or continuous, and as I said before, you also see it referred to as a scale value, a scale variable, and that's what SPSS software we use on this course. Is referred to as scale variables. Okay, so these 4 categories, the main ones really to remember are categorical. You've got categorical scales of measurement, and you've got measurements that are more precise, where we actually measure things. We can measure them with a great deal of precision using ratio or continuous scales, numerical scales, or we can measure them discretely, such as they're in order and there's equal distance between them, or we can just rank them in order. What you will find is a lot of psychologists will they will collapse ordinal interval. They will treat ordinal data like it's interval data, such as answers on some sort of questionnaire. So you get a questionnaire and you ask the question. It's like say how much you agree, or how much this sounds like you, and it could go from 0, not at all like me, to 5, extremely like me, or 0, strongly disagree, to 5. Everyone's come across these types of questionnaires. So someone who puts a 4 compared to puts a 3 might say, I agree, or I'm neutral. We can't really say the distance between those, but if they have the same idea of the scale distance between them. They're ranked in order, but we can't really say they're measured on an equal interval, because we don't really know. Because someone who's saying I agree might be interpreting that scale in a slightly different way to someone who's being neutral, or saying they're neutral, or someone saying strongly agree might not differ that much from someone who's saying they agree, when they're ranking their preferences or something. So what you'll find in psychology is that a lot of psychologists often treat ordinal data like it's interval and analyze it using statistical methods, which is a bit tricky, but it's commonly done. So it's kind of useful to think of, bracket these things into 2 groups. There's categorical data, and there's other stuff on other scales, essentially, be it discrete intervals or continuous intervals. Okay, research designs. So I better get moving because it's already taken a while. I've given this slide a number of different titles because I don't really research methods, research design, approach to data collection. I couldn't really decide what the best title for this was, but here we're talking about the types of design. Maybe design is the best way to say it. The types of design ways we're going to collect data. Okay, the ways we're going to conduct our study. Now there are a number on this list: experimental studies, quasi-experimental studies, correlational studies, questionnaires, observational studies, case studies. I've grayed out the bottom 3. I'm only going to focus on the top 3. Okay, the bottom 3, the top 3 are kind of more common. They often include using questionnaires, but I think people probably have a good intuitive understanding of questionnaires or surveys, essentially. Some research often involves that, but the main 3 when you're conducting research in this discipline are going to be experimental, quasi-experimental, correlational. So these are methods of collecting data to answer a particular research question. Right, let's talk about them one at a time. The top 3, one at a time. Experimental designs. In experimental designs, we randomly assign cases or participants to different groups, and then we compare groups on one or more variables of interest. Okay, so random assignment is to try and ensure that any important differences in the sample will be distributed between the groups, so that any differences in scores on the variables of interest is a result of that particular variable and not other underlying factors. Okay. So when we conduct an experiment, we are generally applying some manipulation or treatment and measuring a change on the variable of interest. The use of a randomized control trial or random assignment, we could just call it, allows us to infer causation. That being that one thing, the thing that we're manipulating, causes the change in the thing that we're measuring. Okay. And when you're conducting experiments, there are additional layers of control that you can add, such as blinding, double-blind designs. Maybe you've heard of these sorts of terms in relation to research experiments. And if you use those, they do add more reliability to the conclusion conclusions you draw. So for example, an example of an experiment to try and make this a bit more concrete is, say we develop some sort of nootropic drug or smart drug, and we want to conduct an experiment to see if people who take it actually are smarter. It makes people smarter. So we could conduct a randomized control trial where we manipulate kind of some sort of independent variable to assess the effect on a dependent variable. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to give some people a drug, a nootropic drug that we've developed that we think makes people smarter, and we're going to give other people maybe a placebo. So there's our manipulation, there's our independent variable. Some are getting, there's two conditions, some are getting a smart drug, some are not getting anything. We're splitting our participants randomly into two groups. Okay, and hopefully that distributes differences in IQ between the people in those groups rather evenly. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to give them some sort of test, some sort of IQ test maybe, or some sort of comprehension test, and we'll see if there's a difference between the groups in who gets the most answers correct. So does the group that we've given the smart drug to, do they do better on the test than people who are just given a placebo? Okay, so that's kind of the type of thing. And if we wanted to make it kind of double blind, we could have it as the case that the researchers who are administering the drug to our participants don't know whether they're giving them a placebo or the actual drug, and the participants don't know whether they're getting the drug or the placebo. Okay. So from that, we could, if we conducted an experiment that had these sorts of controls, we could infer that our manipulation caused the change in effect that we saw. Okay, so I don't know if I'm unusual in this, I think that there are very few true or actual experiments conducted in psychology. So to conduct an experiment well, you need to effectively isolate your variable of interest from all possible confounds that may influence the relationship between your independent variable that you're manipulating and the difference you're trying to measure. Okay, so that brings us on to the next type of research method, and that's quasi-experimental designs. So quasi-experimental designs are similar to experiments. They may involve manipulation of independent variables and random assignment. However, they also involve independent variables that can't be manipulated, and they often these types of quasi-experimental studies often take place outside the very controlled conditions of the lab, which is good in some ways. So strength is that they allow us to study behavior in more realistic and naturalistic settings, and we can include lots of variables because we aren't trying to control or isolate a particular relationship. So quasi-experimental designs can often allow us to put together more complex designs. The weakness is that we can't really infer causation. We can say that we can't say that this causes that, as the effects may be due to the influence of some other factors that we've not actually measured. But they do these sorts of designs, quasi-experimental designs, they allow us to investigate relationships and associations between variables and the relative importance or influence of variables. So they, as I said, they have higher ecological validity. So an example might be, we similar to the last one, the last type of question. Maybe we've got some sort of study. We randomly assign some of our we've got one variable where we randomly assign participants. Maybe they conduct some sort of test whilst they're being watched. Maybe they conduct some sort of test on their own, so there's no one else around them. And where there's a manipulation where we're going to see, do people respond differently to this task when they're being watched or when they're alone? But we might also have a categorical variable such as sex, which we can't manipulate. So we've just got to accept that it's an IV that we can't manipulate. We might then also include a questionnaire scale, so we actually give them some sort of questionnaire where we're measuring their scores on something. It could be a personality inventory or anything like that. And then we could even after measuring all these things, be what we could be looking at doing is get them to play some sort of game where they're making decisions. So quite a complex design there. Very hard to do that experimentally and keep everything nice and tidy and isolate the relationships of interest. So there are lots of different terminology used for quasi-experimental designs. You'll hear them, and a lot of it sounds quite negative or pejorative, I think. So you'll hear them referred to as non-experiments. You'll hear them referred to as pseudo-experiments. When I was an undergraduate learning this sort of stuff, they were just referred to as studies, and that's kind of, I mean, quasi-experimental makes them sound like they're not really experiments as well. So I kind of just refer to these as studies, essentially. All right, so correlation designs. Okay. So these are designs where the researcher doesn't manipulate anything or assign randomly to groups in any way. So the researcher simply collects data on several variables and then conducts some sort of statistical analysis to determine how strongly the variables are related. So you need at least two variables. Yeah. And these kind of correlational studies can only tell us if variables are related. We can't make conclusions about causality. And remember, experiments are the only thing that really allow us to do that. So, for example, we might look at the relationship, use a correlational design to look at the relationship between productivity and sleep. How much sleep someone's got last night, how productive they've been during the day, something like that. Or we might look at the difference between IQ, the relationship between IQ and income. So do people with higher IQs generally higher incomes, that sort of thing. You will often see these referred to, or occasionally see these referred to, as cross-sectional designs. And I think that's kind of a more useful name because it kind of gives you a better idea of how it works. So what's meant by a cross-sectional design is where at a specific time point we're looking at some cross-section, our sample at a specific point in time, and we're measuring our participants on some variable. So like I said, it could be their IQ, it could be their income, it could be how much sleep they got last night, how well they do on some sort of test, that type of thing. Okay, so if you think of it like that, you're recording things at a particular slice in time. So cross-sectional. I think the design name correlational design may come from the fact that we might use a type of correlational statistical analysis on the data, but we don't necessarily have to. It may be frequently the case though, when we're looking at the relationship between two variables, we are doing a correlation analysis like Pearson's correlation, but we don't have to. There are other analyses we could use. Okay, we're nearly finished here. So I mentioned a couple of times in the last few slides independent and dependent variables. Just to clarify what they are in case you've not encountered them before, in case you don't know. So independent variables are the variables that we manipulate in our research design. Dependent variables are the variables we are measuring a change in based on our research design, or based on the result of our manipulation of the independent variable. So for example, let me give a concrete example here. So maybe we're interested in how people's memory, how well they do on a memory test, and the time of the day. And we think that how effective our memory is will be influenced by time of the day. So maybe people remember things better early in the morning when they're fresher. By the evening, when they're a bit tired, maybe they kind of become more forgetful and more fatigued in some way. Yeah. So if we were to conduct some research investigating a question like that, the independent variable would be the time of the day, essentially. So we could get our participants in at different times of day, some in the morning, some in the afternoon, some in the evening, and then test them in some way. So give them a memory test. And the independent variable would be the thing manipulating, whether they do the test, at what time of day they do the test. The dependent variable would be their scores on the actual memory test. Okay. So I put some other terminology on the slide. So independent and dependent variable are the most common terminology used in psychology. So you should be aware of that, and you'll probably use that most commonly. But there is other terminology that's used to describe these types of variables. So for example, there's explanatory variable and response variable, predictor variable and outcome variable, and there you can see the ones they correspond to. So explanatory variable, predictor variable would be another name for an independent variable. The dependent variable is the outcome variable or response variable. So as I said, IV and DV most commonly used in psychology. Other scientific disciplines don't use them because they can, in probability, whether something's dependent or independent has a different meaning to the way it's being used here. So other scientific disciplines prefer terminology such as explanatory variable, response variable. Okay, so one thing I should mention as well, whilst we're on this, is irrelevant variables. So we've got IVs, we've got DVs, we've also got irrelevant variables. And these are variables that the experiment is not interested in either manipulating or measuring, but they may affect participants' scores on the dependent variable. Okay, so they're irrelevant to the hypothesis we're interested in, but they may increase the variability of participants' scores. So they're just things that might be influencing the results of the thing we're interested in measuring. They're not necessarily a problem unless they become confounding variables. Okay, so confounding variables are a bad thing to have. And we could define those as an irrelevant variable that varies systematically with the independent variable. Okay, so we're measuring two things, we've kind of got a relationship of interest. There might be irrelevant variables that we're trying to ignore, but there might be some sort of confounding variable that's influencing the relationship between our IV and DV in a systematic way. And the problem with having confounds such as this is you can't tell if any differences found on your DV are due to the independent variable or due to the confounding variable. They're probably due to both in many cases. Okay. Methods of data collection. Right, this is pretty much the last bit that we're going to cover here because we've already gone on quite a long time. Right, so this is related to study design. So we talked about study design, we talked about experiments and things like that. The way you set up the design of your study, we can choose between two methods of data collection. These are between groups designs and within groups designs. And in the first case, we manipulate the independent variables using different entities. So different groups take part in different conditions, and we compare differences in scores between those groups. And that is what's known as a between groups design. Other names for it include things such as between subjects, independent groups. So the participants take part in only one condition. Okay, so we've got two conditions. Do they get the smart drug? Do they get a placebo? We've got a lot of participants. Participants only either get the smart drug or they get the placebo. They don't get both. Okay, at different times. Right. The second, the within groups design, is where we manipulate the independent variables using the same entities. So the same participants take part in all conditions or all levels of our independent variable at different times. So this is known as within subjects design. So within groups or repeating measures are common names for that. So you can have a mixed design where some variables are independent and some are repeated. So for example, concrete example to illustrate these two things, we could, if we were looking at alcohol use and driving errors, so whether if you consume alcohol, your driving becomes dangerous and you make more errors, What we could do is we could set that up as an independent groups design where we get a load of participants in. We give some participants some type of alcohol, some participants a placebo, and then we get them to do some sort of driving simulation game, and we count how many errors they make. That would be an independent groups design. Alternatively, we could set that up as a repeated measures design, where we at one time we get our participants in and we give them some alcohol and we get them to do the driving simulation, see how many errors they make, and then at another time, maybe a week later, we get them to come in and we give them a placebo and we see how many driving errors they make, and we compare the differences between the two. Okay, so yeah, there are many research questions where you could use either design, and it's often the case that it can be easier to use it between subjects design, and there's strengths and weaknesses to both. Right. Right, we'll finish with an example. We're already 5 minutes over the hour here. When I actually give this lecture in person, I'm going to have to speed up a little bit, say less. Right, so here's an example. I borrowed this from Gene's slides. I thought it was quite good. I thought it's a good way to just sort of get you thinking about IVs, DVs, irrelevant variables. So Professor Logic suspects that students who read their statistics textbook before a lecture understand statistics better than those who don't. At the end of the lecture, he gives them a short statistics test and asks students if they read their textbook before class. Okay, so what is the independent variable? How many levels? How has it been operationalized is question 1. What is the dependent variable? How is it being operationalized? Okay, and can you think of an irrelevant variable? Okay, so the independent variable in this case is reading textbook before the lecture. And there are 2 levels, yes and no. So the professor asked them, do you read your textbook before stats class? And some they've either said, yes I do, or no I don't. And it's been operationalized, which means that how are we defining, how are we going to record this? How are we defining what this behavior is, how we capture this behavior? It's been by asking students which group they're in. So they're basically sort of self-identifying whether they read or don't read their textbook. Okay, the dependent variable is their understanding of statistics, and this has been operationalized by giving a statistics test and measuring the number of questions correct. Okay, so the DV is their understanding of statistics based on the test. An irrelevant variable might be student motivation, so how motivated they are, and the question remains, if it's irrelevant, if motivation of the student is irrelevant, is an irrelevant variable, is it also potentially a confounding variable? It's something we've not measured as being of interest to our research question, but could it confound the results? And the answer is yes, it is more than likely a confounding variable. And the reason for this is that student motivation may vary systematically with the independent variable, so reading textbook before the lecture. So is it the case that students do better on the test because they read their textbook before the lecture? You can't really separate that out from motivation. It's likely the case that the students that read their textbook before the lecture are the students who are more motivated. So students who are more motivated, more likely to read before lecture than students who are less motivated. If Professor Hopeful finds a difference between the 2 groups and their scores on the stats test, is it because they read the textbook before the lecture, or is it because they are motivated and if they're motivated, they also may pay more attention, listen more closely during the lecture? How could this have been avoided? Well, Professor Logic has conducted a quasi-experimental study. Students allocated themselves to groups essentially, and that's not being controlled for. Random allocation of students to groups before conducting the experiment would have meant the effect of motivation would have been randomly distributed between the 2 groups. So Professor Logic has not chosen the best method in this case. There was another point I was going to say in relation to that as well. Yeah, but we'll leave it at that because time is moving on. Right. So here's just some references before we finish. So Andy Field textbook, Discovering Statistics using IBM SPSS Statistics. I've put the 2013 reference there. There's a more recent version now, which use the most recent. I can't remember what edition that is off the top of my head. But that's chapter 1 of that's kind of quite useful for a review of this type of research design, variables, IVs, DVs, all that type of thing. Also, there's a textbook by Howitt and Kramer called Research Methods in Psychology. The first 4 chapters of that, if you wish to dip into it, give a good rundown on research design and random experiments and random control trials, pseudo experiments, etc. The third one I've put on there is one that I quite like. You can get e-copies of it if you log into the library. It's by Tim Erden. It's called Statistics in Plain English. If you look at chapter 1 of that, I think it gives a good explanation. It gives a good straightforward explanation of some of the stuff we've been talking about in this session. Alright guys, that's the end. I've talked for far too long. When I give this lecture in person, I'm going to have to cut some stuff out, I think, but hopefully this is useful as a supplement. Okay, see you soon. Thanks very much.